Welcome to a journey through time where history isn't just a memory, but a vivid landscape of events and emotions waiting to be explored anew. You stand at the gates of a crumbling medieval fortress, the cold mist of England curling around your boots while the distant thud of hooves stirs the stillness. Somewhere behind the walls, a king is throwing a tantrum about a lost treasure or a rebellious baron, and you unfortunately are expected to listen. This isn't the fairy tale world of noble monarchs and chivalry. This is where the scepters were heavier than the crowns they bore, where bad decisions rippled for generations, and where many kings made a mess of their kingdoms, their courts, and their legacies. And tonight you're going to meet them, one by one. They're loud, moody, and occasionally convinced they're made of glass. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your location and local time. I love seeing where this sleepy little kingdom reaches. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first royal misadventure begins with none other than King John of England. You know the villain from every Robin Hood story ever told. But tonight you're not in Sherwood Forest. You're trudging through the damp corridors of 13th century England's worst PR disaster. You hear him before you see him. A muffled screech of rage from behind a thick wooden door, followed by the shattering sound of something likely a chalice meeting a stone wall. That's just Tuesday in the reign of King John. Born in 1166 as the youngest of Henry II's sons, John was never meant to rule. His nickname John Lackland literally meant he had no inheritance. It's hard not to feel a tiny bit bad for him, until you realize what he did when he finally got power. Now imagine being ruled by a man who taxed you for breathing, raged at his nobles like a petulant teen, and frequently lost wars with a level of consistency that could only be called impressive. After alienating pretty much everyone with a sword, John earned the dubious distinction of losing Normandy, yes, all of it to the French. It was like misplacing half your kingdom and then blaming the map. And speaking of blame, he had a special talent for making enemies. He feuded with the Pope so fiercely that England was excommunicated. Not him personally, the entire kingdom. Imagine being so bad at diplomacy that your whole country gets spiritually evicted. But perhaps the most iconic low point, besides dying of dysentery surrounded by angry barons, was John's role in the Magna Carta. He was forced to sign it in 1215 after the barons got tired of his nonsense. To be fair, it wasn't a grand act of democratic vision, it was more like a fed-up HR meeting with swords, but still, it laid the groundwork for modern constitutional law. John didn't even stick to the agreement. Within weeks of signing, he tried to wriggle out of it, plunging the kingdom into civil war. Historians still argue whether John's failures were due to incompetence, insecurity, or a pathological need to tick everyone off. And then there's the quirkier stuff. He allegedly starved a noble family to death in a dungeon. Kept a personal menagerie of exotic pets. Some say he tried training a lion, and may have been the kind of guy who double-dipped his bread into shared sauce. We can't confirm that last bit, but it feels true. You pass the open window now and hear him muttering to himself about lost treasure. Ah, yes, the lost crown jewels. In 1216, while fleeing across the marshes of East Anglia, John's baggage train sank into the Wash quicksand, horses and all. Legend has it the crown jewels are still somewhere in that muck. A fitting end for a reign defined by pettiness, paranoia, and poor planning. There's something deeply sleepy about this kind of chaos. All the yelling and losing battles. You can almost hear the barons snoring at council meetings while John whines about another tax hike. And you curled in a damp cloak, Wonder if all kings are like this, or if you've just stumbled into the world's longest royal tantrum. As you drift from the cold halls of Windsor and the watery echoes of the wash, the candle flickers. King John fades into the mist, grumbling, grasping, and forgotten. Another king waits ahead, and he's even balder than he is bold. You trudge on through centuries like fog, your boots now squelching softly on damp earth as a ghostly church bell tolls in the far distance. France looms ahead, fractured, fragile, and just beginning to discover how truly unlucky it can be when it comes to monarchs. The sky is overcast as if history itself is bracing for a bad decision, and beneath a sagging velvet canopy sits a man with a solemn face and a truly unfortunate name, Charles the Bald. No, seriously, that's what they called him. Though historians still argue whether Charles was actually bald or if the name was sarcastic. Medieval nicknames weren't always literal. Remember Charles the Simple. Not a great track record. Some scholars believe bald meant something closer to bare of lands, at first a political jab that somehow stuck to his scalp like honey to a monk's beard. Charles was born in 823, the son of Louis the Pious, and grandson of none other than Charlemagne himself, who must have rolled aggressively in his crypt at the state of things by the time Charles came to power. France at this point wasn't the France, you know. It was a deliciously complicated mess of kingdoms, dukedoms, and what can only be described as noble sibling rivalry stretched across the map like spilled soup. As with most royal disasters, it began with inheritance. Charles was a younger son with big ambitions and not nearly enough land to match. Cue the family feud of the century. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 split Charlemagne's once great empire into three messy chunks. West Francia went to Charles east to his brother Louis the German, and Middle Francia to Lothair, who drew the short straw because that middle part included Italy and some really annoying mountains. And yet Charles wasn't content. He wanted more. More land, more power, more titles. What he got instead was rebellion after rebellion, Viking invasions and nobles who treated loyalty like a suggestion. You can picture him now seated awkwardly on a throne that was just a bit too big, adjusting his ill-fitting crown and pretending everything was fine while trying to suppress a nosebleed. Charles was also deeply paranoid. He feared his nobles were plotting against him, which, to be fair, they usually were. So he spent a large portion of his reign scrambling between regions, desperately trying to hold his territory together with half-written decrees, sacks of coin, and the kind of diplomatic finesse usually reserved for wet pigeons. One quirky tidbit: Charles may have been the first medieval monarch to hold a formal coronation ceremony using holy oil, setting a precedent for future French kings. Which is impressive if only the rest of his reign had such coherence. He also attempted a bold experiment in trying to standardize coinage, which was promptly ignored by pretty much everyone because local barons preferred their own adorable currencies with confusing names like livre tournois and denier of Aquitaine. But let's not forget the cherry on top of Charles' bad reign, the Vikings. Yes, those guys again. While he was busy fighting his brothers and cousins and possibly his own advisors, the Norsemen sailed straight up the Seine and raided Paris. His response: pay them to go away, which worked, until they realized they could just come back and get paid again. It's the medieval version of rewarding bad behavior, and it made Charles look a bit like a frightened landlord bribing raccoons not to eat his roof. To be fair, Charles did have some moments of attempted bravery. In 877, he marched into Italy to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, because if you're going to be a terrible king, you might as well collect titles like stamps. Unfortunately, he died on the way back, either from dysentery fever or just pure exhaustion. Contemporary sources suggest he passed away alone in a peasant's hut, far from courtly splendor, likely muttering about taxes and treaties no one remembered. Charles's reign is a curious blend of legacy and letdown. He helped shape what would become modern France, but only through accident, misfortune, and relentless brotherly squabbling. His memory is mostly footnoted today between more dramatic monarchs. Still, there's something oddly comforting about him. A man trying really, really hard and mostly failing, but doing it in such an endearingly human way. You pass through the curtain of his age, leaving behind the clang of coins, the rustle of unread treaties, and the muffled sobbing of exhausted scribes. The road curls onward now toward a gilded city far to the east. A palace shimmers in the distance, but don't be fooled. Inside, a man is spinning in a chair, laughing to himself and occasionally barking at invisible demons. Yes, it's about to get much, much weirder. The road to Constantinople is paved with mosaics, shadows, and the flickering gold of fading empires. You drift into the cool, marbled silence of the Byzantine court, where domed ceilings whisper forgotten prayers and incense hangs thick in the air. The palace is vast, too vast, in fact, for the troubled man who now rules it. He sits alone, eyes darting, muttering beneath his breath, and occasionally barking at walls. You've just entered the reign of Emperor Justin II, the man who spun in circles while his empire burned. Justin II came to power in 565 AD, succeeding his illustrious uncle Justinian the Far, the man who built the Hagia Sophia and reconquered half the Roman world. Those were big sandals to fill. Unfortunately, Justin's own contributions to history were more existentially uncomfortable. At first glance, Justin II doesn't seem all that terrible. He was energetic, decisive, and genuinely wanted to continue his uncle's legacy. But that ambition swiftly devolved into paranoia and nervous collapse, which makes sense when your empire's getting squeezed from three directions by Lombards, Avars, and Persians. It's the geopolitical equivalent of trying to keep three angry cats in a box with your bare hands. Historians still argue whether Justin was predisposed to mental instability, or if the stress of running a decaying empire simply cracked him wide open. Either way, by the early 570s, things started getting very strange. He began suffering from sudden fits of rage, violent table-flipping rages. One account describes him biting attendants, another has him screaming so loudly it echoed through the palace halls for hours. The strangest detail, he commissioned a spinning chair. Yes, a gilded throne that rotated slowly, designed to soothe his agitations. When the world felt too overwhelming, and for Justin that was often, he'd sit in his special chair and spin in gentle circles while royal courtiers looked away, pretending nothing was wrong. You're watching it now. A once mighty emperor gently rotating like a sleepy child on a playground. Merry-go-round eyes glazed, whispering about traitors and shadows. It would be endearing if it weren't so tragic, and if the fate of a massive empire didn't rest on the whims of a man who could barely sit still. Eventually, Justin II realized he couldn't do this anymore. In one of the rare lucid moments of his reign, he adopted a general named Tiberius as his heir, essentially saying, "You deal with it, I'm going to spin now." From then on, Justin became emperor in name, only occasionally appearing in public, in carefully choreographed displays where everyone ignored his tendency to hum at stone lions. One fringe tidbit. It's rumored that during one episode he insisted that the walls of the palace were speaking to him in Armenian, a language he didn't understand. Another time he supposedly banned certain musical scales, claiming they stirred demons from beneath the tiles. While this sounds like myth, several chroniclers mention his obsession with unnatural harmonics and how he would clamp his ears shut during hymns. But don't let the madness overshadow the destruction. Under his rule, the Byzantines lost massive chunks of territory in Italy to the Lombards. The eastern frontier burned with Persian conflict. The treasury bled silver, and the people, once proud citizens of an eternal empire, watched their world unravel under the anxious gaze of a man who no longer recognized them. You wander through the grand corridors now where every surface gleams with gold and sorrow. The mosaics shimmer with saints who look away from the throne as if embarrassed. The air hums with the silence of people trying not to notice that their emperor has entirely unmoored himself from reality. Still, there's something oddly peaceful about the whole thing. Justin wasn't cruel like some kings to come. He didn't command mass executions or unleash mad religious purges. He simply collapsed. His reign is a long, nervous exhale, a spiral of unraveling decisions and desperate moments. He tried to be strong, but the weight of it crushed him. You can almost hear the chair squeak gently as it spins, the only rhythm left in a palace that once pulsed with power. And then with one last slow rotation, the throne stills. Justin II fades into the past, his legacy more whispered than remembered. He is replaced, buried in marble and forgotten by time, but only after dragging an empire behind him like a threadbare robe. The next room is colder. France again. And this time you must tread carefully, very carefully. The man you're about to meet believes he's made of glass. The torch in your hand flickers as you pass into a grand yet dimly lit hallway. Tall stained glass windows shimmer in silence. The air feels brittle, like something might shatter if you breathe too hard. You step lightly, carefully, because here in the heart of 14th century France, you are now in the presence of King Charles VI. The monarch who believed quite sincerely that he was made entirely of glass. Born in 1368 and crowned at the age of just 11, Charles VI began his reign with promise. He was handsome, well-educated, and even called le bien-aimé, the beloved. His early years suggested stability for a France still licking its wounds from the Hundred Years' War. But you know how this story goes. Things were too quiet, too hopeful, too symmetrical. And symmetry in medieval politics rarely lasts. By his mid-20s, things began to change. The headache started first. Then came the hallucinations, the delusions, and then most famously his belief that his body was made of glass. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. He reportedly wore special clothing reinforced with iron rods sewn into his robes to protect him from breaking. And he forbade people from touching him, terrified that even a simple bump could reduce him to shards. Historians still argue whether Charles suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or some unique neurological condition worsened by the era's lack of treatment. But regardless of the diagnosis, the damage was undeniable. During one episode, he attacked his own men, killing several before collapsing. Another time, he wandered the halls of the Louvre babbling to himself and forgetting he was king altogether. And yet somehow France didn't immediately collapse. Instead, it began a slow spiral into chaos propped up by opportunists and relatives with questionable motives. The king's incapacity created a power vacuum, one filled by ambitious uncles feuding dukes, and Queen Isabeau, his wife, who became a political figure in her own right, though not without controversy. Rumors swirled about her loyalty, her lovers, and whether she was secretly planning to replace Charles with one of his cousins. The kingdom fractured into factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. These weren't polite party disagreements. They were Civil War-level rivalries that drenched Paris in blood and left the countryside teetering. And in the middle of it all, a king in reinforced robes, too frightened to move, convinced he would shatter if he did. You imagine the scene, a council meeting filled with nobles arguing about taxes and troop movements, while Charles, seated on his fragile throne, stares fixedly at a candle. Every now and then he whispers something nonsensical like, "The glass is singing," and everyone just nods politely and carries on. It's both tragic and darkly absurd, like trying to run a country through a foggy dream. One quirky tidbit. During one of his lucid stretches, Charles reportedly loved masquerades and insisted on holding elaborate costumed balls. At one such event, the infamous Bal d'Ardent, he and several nobles dressed as wild men in flammable costumes. Someone brought a torch too close and the dancers burst into flames. 4 of them died. Charles survived, but barely. The people took it as a sign that the king was cursed, and honestly, you can't really blame them. Another lesser known detail, he once forgot his own name. For over a week, he reportedly believed he was made of glass and that his name was George. No one knew why. No one dared to correct him. Eventually, his son, the future Charles VII, would step in, but only after years of bloodshed, the rise of Joan of Arc, and a tug-of-war with the English that left the French monarchy a battered ghost of its former self. Charles VI lived long enough to see the disaster he'd presided over continue, a man broken not by enemies or betrayal, but by his own mind. You move gently past the throne now, watching the faint outline of Charles's silhouette fade into the glass-streaked air. His robes don't rustle. His footsteps never quite echo. He remains a king of illusions, fragile dreams, and whispered fears. And while you think things can't possibly get worse, a new scent reaches your nose oil steel and a trace of blood. Castile calls next, and with it comes a ruler who made cruelty an art form. He doesn't think he's made of glass. He knows he's made of knives. The sun sets red over the plains of Castile, and the sky seems to bleed into the stones beneath your feet. You've left the shadows of delicate glass and uncertainty behind. Now the world turns hard, sharp, and absolutely certain. You're entering the reign of Pedro of Castile, better known by his charming nickname, Pedro the Cruel. Born in 1334 and crowned king, at just 16, Pedro wasted little time proving that teenage angst, when paired with absolute power, could get very messy very fast. At first, he was Pedro the Just. That was before the executions, the assassinations, and the habit of inviting people to dinner only to kill them before dessert. You're walking through his court now, which feels less like a palace and more like a chessboard soaked in wine and secrets. Courtiers whisper, servants scurry, and every eye glances sideways. No one here is safe, least of all you. Pedro's reign from 1350 to 1369 was a tangle of betrayals, civil war and intrigue so thick it could choke a knight. His mother Maria of Portugal was sidelined. His mistress Maria de Padilla was adored, scorned, reinstalled, and possibly poisoned. His half-brother Henry of Trastamara spent years trying to dethrone him. And Pedro's own nobles, tired of guessing whether they'd be rewarded or executed, frequently switched sides mid-war. One noble even defected twice in the same week. Risky. Let's talk methods. Pedro didn't simply kill his enemies, he performed executions with the flair of a medieval stage director. One archbishop was stabbed during negotiations. A noblewoman was garroted in her bedroom. And he's rumored to have personally stabbed his own brother Fadrique after inviting him to a friendly chat. What followed was less a conversation and more a fatal misunderstanding involving blades. Historians still argue whether Pedro's reputation was entirely deserved or largely a smear campaign by his enemies, especially his half-brother Henry, who won the throne in the historical narrative. After all, Pedro the Cruel makes a much better villain than Henry the jealous usurper. Still, the facts are stubborn. Pedro's kill count was high and his temper higher. Quirky tidbit 1. Pedro had a bizarre obsession with clocks. Yes, clocks. He imported intricate timepieces from France and is said to have funded an entire team of craftsmen to create what may have been the most elaborate medieval clock in Iberia, all while the kingdom was on fire. Quirky tidbit 2. He loved disguises, like really loved them. He would sneak out of the palace in costume, mingling with commoners and eavesdropping in taverns. Sometimes he handed out coins, sometimes he arrested people on the spot. It was the worst surprise party game ever invented. And then there was the war with Aragon, and the war with his brother, and the war with France, and also the Black Death, which arrived conveniently in the middle of all this, and only added to the general sense of doom. At one point, the Castilian court resembled less a government and more a haunted carnival with sharp objects and diplomatic corpses. Eventually, Henry had enough. Backed by the French and the notorious mercenary Bertrand du Guesclin, he marched on Pedro. There were captures, escapes, betrayals, and finally a last brutal confrontation in 1369 at Montiel. Pedro was tricked into a trap and dragged before Henry, who stabbed him to death after a brief and very undiplomatic struggle. Or if you prefer the more colorful version, Bertrand held Pedro down while Henry did the stabbing. Either way, the throne was now Henry's, and the nickname the Cruel was Pedro's forever. And yet, it wasn't all bad. Pedro was also known to protect Jews and Muslims in his court, a rare thing in a time when religious intolerance was standard issue. He punished corrupt nobles and tried to centralize power under the crown. But his brutality, even when directed toward the corrupt, was so extreme that his legacy sank beneath it. Now, as you exit the court, the stone walls seem to echo with Pedro's last words, possibly a curse, possibly a complaint about being tricked. His blood may have dried centuries ago, but the chill he left behind still lingers in the throne room. Ahead lies England again. But not the grand tapestries and noble charges. No, this time it's bumbling councils, poor decisions, and a king whose very name screamed unprepared. You arrive in England once more, trudging over a rain-slicked path as the clouds swirl above like anxious advisors. There's a silence in the air, less ominous, more awkward, as if history itself doesn't quite know what to say. You push open a heavy oaken door and step into the reign of Ethelred the Unready, a man so synonymous with bad timing and worse planning that even his nickname is embarrassed. Let's get the name out of the way. Unready didn't originally mean ill-prepared. It came from the Old English unread, meaning bad counsel or no advice. Ethelred's actual name means noble counsel, so his title is essentially a cruel historical pun. Noble counsel, the no counsel. Even the Anglo-Saxons couldn't resist a sarcastic jab. Born in 968 and ruling from 978 with a brief intermission, Ethelred's time on the throne was defined by one thing: Vikings. So many Vikings. All the Vikings. Raiding towns, burning monasteries, demanding money. And what was Ethelred's master strategy for defending England? Pay them. Yes, he invented the Danegeld tax raise specifically to give the Vikings money so they'd leave. Spoiler alert, they didn't leave. Because what's better than sacking a village, getting paid to threaten to sack it, than doing it anyway next season for double the price? Historians still argue whether this was cowardice, economic genius, or sheer desperation. But the results were dismal. The more money Ethelred gave the Danes, the more they came. It's like trying to bribe a bear with honey not to return to your campsite. Every spring, with friends. The real low point. In 1002, Ethelred made what might be the single worst political move of the century. He ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre, a coordinated killing of all Danes living in England. This was not only horrific, it backfired. One of the victims may have been the sister of Swine Forkbeard, King of Denmark. The next year, Swine invaded with a vengeance that made previous Viking raids look like mildly inconvenient picnics. And just like that, Ethelred's kingdom became a game board for Norse kings and mercenary fleets. He fled to Normandy at one point, leaving his throne behind like a half-finished crossword puzzle. When Swine died unexpectedly in 1014, Ethelred was invited back but with conditions. The nobles basically said, "You can be king again, but only if you promise to stop making terrible decisions." That's not encouraging. That's not leadership. That's the medieval version of "don't screw this up again." Quirky tidbit 1. Ethelred had a fondness for lavish clothing. Even in times of war and crisis, he made sure his court was dressed in embroidered silks and rich furs. His robes were often so long and heavy they needed to be lifted by attendants. Because nothing says battle readiness like being unable to walk across a room without help. Quirky tidbit 2. He installed a massive indoor bath complex at his royal palace. Baths were uncommon luxuries at the time, and his was heated, scented, and staffed. While the kingdom burned, Ethelred was soaking. One could argue it was at least a clean disaster. And what of his legacy? Ethelred's reign led directly to England being conquered by the Danes. After his death in 1016, his son Edmund Ironside tried to resist, but the crown ultimately went to Canute, the Danish king. Ethelred's dynasty stumbled and collapsed like a poorly built barn in a windstorm. Yet for all his failures, you can't help but feel a pang of pity. Ethelred inherited the throne at age 10 after his half-brother Edward was mysteriously murdered, possibly by Ethelred's own mother. That's a heavy crown for a child to bear, especially one surrounded by scheming nobles and a never-ending sea of longships. Now as you walk through the misty fields of Wessex, you can almost see him in the distance, a tired figure in regal robes, too heavy for his shoulders, peering toward the coast, and hoping just once the sails on the horizon aren't Viking. They always are. And as his shadow fades behind you, another rises to the east. A man raised in opulence, crowned in fire, and destined to become Russia's most fearsome monarch. He wasn't unready. He was too ready, and that was the problem. You cross into Russia beneath a sky full of ash-gray clouds. The snow crunches beneath your feet, sharp and dry like the bones of forgotten courtiers. The wind here doesn't whistle, it bites. And at the far end of a frozen courtyard stands a child cloaked in sable fur eyes, wide with fire and something deeper. Something darker. You've arrived in the age of Ivan to the Four of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible, and this is where cruelty becomes an institution. Born in 1530, Ivan was crowned Grand Prince of Moscow at age 3. By the time he was 8, both his parents were dead. His father poisoned his mother, possibly murdered. From then on, Ivan's childhood became a horror story told in golden halls. He was left in the care of nobles who beat him, starved him, and mocked his lineage. He grew up not in comfort, but in paranoia. By his teen years, he was tossing live animals from palace walls for sport and threatening attendants with hot pokers. That warm glow. Not a hearth, it's his temper simmering. And yet for all this darkness, Ivan was brilliant. At age 16, he declared himself Tsar of all Ruses, the first to do so. The title meant Caesar, a new level of autocracy, divinely sanctioned and terrifyingly absolute. And at first he ruled well. He reformed law codes, created a standing army, and even married the noble and stabilizing Anastasia Romanovna. For a brief glimmering moment, things looked almost hopeful. But this is Ivan we're talking about. Nothing gold can stay, especially not in the Kremlin. After Anastasia's death in 1560, possibly by poison, Ivan broke. Not metaphorically, not gradually. He simply snapped. He blamed the boyars, the Russian nobles, for everything: her death, political conspiracies, disloyalty, the weather. He soon withdrew from court life only to re-emerge with an army of thugs, dressed in black, mounted on black horses, wielding black weapons. They were called the Oprichnina. Their job to purge, to terrorize, to enforce Ivan's will through torture, public execution, and land seizure. Entire towns vanished under suspicion. In Novgorod, Ivan ordered a massacre that lasted 5 full weeks, thousands dead, rivers choked with bodies, churches desecrated. The town never truly recovered. Historians still argue whether Ivan believed he was cleansing Russia or simply reveling in domination. Quirky tidbit. One Ivan had a strange fondness for theological debate and wrote long letters arguing about Christian doctrine with anyone foolish enough to reply. His tone fluctuated between scholarly and absolutely unhinged. One letter begins with a polite salutation and ends with detailed threats of divine smiting and disembowelment. Multitasking. Quirky tidbit 2. He composed liturgical chants and was known to sing during council meetings. Pictured a room full of nervous officials and the Tsar just belts out a hymn. And if you didn't clap, well, you might not leave with your hands attached. Then there's the most infamous act of his life. In a fit of rage during an argument, Ivan struck his own son, the heir to the throne, in the head with his staff. The blow killed him. He wept after, they say, holding the body, blood dripping from his fingers as he begged forgiveness no one could grant. The image remains Russia's most terrible ruler, broken by his own violence, rocking the lifeless form of his legacy. A man who had built a kingdom of fear only to find himself its loneliest prisoner. Even in death, Ivan didn't rest. His body was exhumed centuries later, and researchers found high levels of mercury in his remains. Whether it was medicine or slow assassination, no one can say for sure. As you pass through the frostbitten streets of Moscow, the air hangs heavy with stories. Some whispered, some screamed, none forgotten. Ivan's reign left Russia centralized, powerful, and permanently scarred. He proved a king could become a god and then a demon and still be obeyed. But as his figure fades in the snow, you sense something stranger ahead. A court of whispers, shadows, and dolls. A king not terrifying, but entirely incapable. Denmark calls now, and its next ruler prefers to play pretend while the adults make decisions. You step lightly now, the snow behind you, giving way to damp, creaky wooden floors and candlelit hallways lined with tapestries depicting battles this king will never fight. The walls feel closer here, the air heavier, perfumed, not with incense or blood, but a faint trace of lavender oil and something stranger: childhood. You've arrived in 18th century Denmark, and seated at the center of this hushed dollhouse of a court is King Christian VII, the monarch who preferred puppet shows to policy and let others pull the strings. Born in 1749 and crowned king at just 17, Christian VII seemed poised for greatness, tall, intelligent, and charming when he tried. But behind the polished exterior was a deeply unstable mind. Modern historians suspect schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, though at the time it was chalked up to melancholy, weak nerves, or a simple case of royal eccentricity. Unfortunately, eccentricity is less endearing when it runs an entire country. Christian's early childhood was, to put it mildly, dysfunctional. His father, King Frederick V, was frequently drunk, and his mother died when he was just a toddler. He was raised by stern tutors who believed in rigorous beatings and long, lonely hours of study ingredients that rarely produce a well-adjusted adult. By his teenage years, Christian was already showing signs of mental distress, hallucinations, mood swings, compulsive tics, and outbursts. He once reportedly insisted on smearing his face with butter before addressing foreign diplomats. There's not really a diplomatic protocol for that. Despite this, he was married off to his cousin, the English princess Caroline Matilda. She arrived expecting royal dignity and instead found herself married to a man who laughed at funerals, played pranks on ministers, and would sometimes refuse to speak for days, instead pointing at imaginary insects on the palace walls. But Christian wasn't evil, just utterly adrift. So the Danish court improvised. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor who initially treated Christian's mental health and ended up taking over the entire government. Think of him as the therapist turned prime minister, wielding influence through whispered suggestions and forged signatures. For 4 surreal years, Christian was king in name only, while Struensee introduced sweeping Enlightenment reforms abolishing torture, promoting education, and limiting censorship. It was Denmark's most progressive era run entirely behind the scenes. And here's where it gets spicy. Caroline Matilda, trapped in a royal marriage with a man who named his dog Kiss Me, fell for Struensee. The affair was scandalous, open, and documented with suspicious efficiency. The Queen rode horseback in men's clothes, visited his quarters at night, and bore a daughter whose paternity is still debated. One fringe theory even suggests they were planning a coup to depose Christian entirely, though this might be more romantic gossip than actual plotting. Quirky tidbit. One Christian had a fascination with marionettes and toy theaters. He would spend hours in his chambers staging elaborate performances complete with tiny props and costumes. Diplomats sometimes had to wait while the king finished his scenes. One ambassador described watching Christian reenact a naval battle using carved wooden ducks. He was not amused. Quirky tidbit too. Christian developed a habit of slapping people without warning, including nobles and foreign guests. It wasn't malicious, more like a confused child testing boundaries. His court learned to dodge, smile politely, and pretend it hadn't happened. Eventually, the fantasy fell apart. The conservative factions at court, led by Christian's stepmother, Queen Dowager Juliana Maria, staged a coup. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and publicly executed in 1772. Caroline Matilda was exiled to Germany, where she died young and bitter. Christian, left without allies or guidance, retreated into a fog of silence and childlike rituals. He would live another 4 decades. Technically king, but functionally absent, a porcelain figure in a glass case, polished occasionally but never truly awake. You exit the room now, past velvet curtains and painted ceilings. A servant gently closes the door behind you, careful not to wake the king who sleeps at odd hours and whispers to invisible friends. Ahead lies a castle built in dreams, a place of turrets, swans, and moonlight. A kingdom ruled not by incompetence or cruelty, but fantasy until fantasy ran out of money. The sky lightens as you step into Bavaria, but it's not the blue of morning. It's the strange, flickering palette of twilight dreams. Mist curls gently around lakes like drifting sighs. Towers rise impossibly from mountaintops. You've arrived at Neuschwanstein, the fairy tale castle brought to life by one man's obsession. But this isn't the realm of Disney. It's the crumbling fantasy world of King Ludwig of Bavaria, the monarch who built castles instead of kingdoms and ruled from a distance, mostly because he hated people. Born in 1845 and crowned king at 18, Ludwig II was tall, introverted, and possessed of what you might politely call a theatrical spirit. His early reign began with some promise he modernized parts of the government and was a patron of the arts, but his heart was never in politics. From the very beginning, Ludwig longed not to rule but to escape. Escape he did with style. Instead of attending cabinet meetings, Ludwig disappeared for days, weeks, even months at a time, retreating to the mountains or locking himself in his palace. While most kings raised armies, he raised Neuschwanstein, a castle, ripped straight from a Wagnerian opera, literally. Ludwig was obsessed with composer Richard Wagner. He funded his operas, housed him during exile, and wrote him long, gushing letters full of metaphors involving swans and moonlight. Historians still debate whether this was romantic, spiritual, or simply Ludwig being Ludwig. While his ministers begged him to deal with budgets, Ludwig designed castles. Not one, not two, but three extravagant palaces built with obsessive detail. He personally reviewed blueprints and demanded changes like the ceiling must shimmer like the night sky or make the balcony resemble the wing of a swan in mid-flight. Architecture was his politics. Quirky tidbit one. Ludwig refused to dine with people. He built elaborate contraptions so food could be served without human interaction. One such device was a dumbwaiter table that descended through the floor so that servants could set it out of sight, then raise it silently back up. The result, total solitude, just him and roast duck for two. Quirky tidbit 2. He rode through the forest at night in a golden sleigh lit by torches dressed in velvet robes embroidered with stars. Villagers whispered that he was a ghost or possibly the moon come to visit. He reportedly liked the silence of night because, as he said, the sun is vulgar. Ludwig's love of fantasy wasn't harmless, though. His building projects plunged Bavaria into crushing debt. While his castles soared into the clouds, the kingdom's finances plummeted into the mud. He borrowed obsessively, bypassed ministers, and ignored warning after warning. Eventually, the government had had enough. In 1886, they declared him insane based on second-hand reports and suspiciously convenient paperwork and moved to depose him. What followed was either tragedy or murder, depending on whom you ask. Ludwig was arrested at Neuschwanstein and taken to Lake Starnberg. The next morning, he was found dead in shallow water alongside his psychiatrist, Dr. Gooden. The official report claimed suicide by drowning, though Ludwig was a strong swimmer. There were no witnesses, and both men's bodies bore signs of struggle. Historians still argue, was it political murder, a final act of despair, or simply the tragic end of a man who refused to live in a world that didn't match his imagination? Today, Ludwig is remembered with more fondness than he ever knew in life. Tourists flock to his castles, especially Neuschwanstein, which Walt Disney famously used as inspiration for Sleeping Beauty's castle. It's poetic in a way the lonely king who couldn't lead became the architect of dreams. But in his own time, he was dismissed as mad eccentric and incapable. While Germany moved toward unification and Bismarck's iron policies reshaped Europe, Ludwig floated in his own ether of swan's music and unreachable ideals. You walk now through the halls of Neuschwanstein, each room a glittering echo chamber of solitude. Murals tell stories of knights and gods, but the king's voice is nowhere. Only soft footsteps, perhaps yours, reminding the castle that it once had an inhabitant who believed too deeply in beauty and not enough in reality. As you descend the mountain path, the towers vanish behind a veil of fog. Bavaria fades, and in the distance the shadow of another English king looms quiet, delicate, and utterly out of his depth. He won't build castles, he won't lead armies. In fact, he'll barely speak at all. The fog thickens as you return to England, not with fanfare or fury, but with a quiet stillness, as though history itself is holding its breath. You arrive at a court where voices are hushed, decisions postponed, and the king sits in silence for days, unmoving, unblinking. This is the reign of King Henry VI, the monarch who forgot he was king and watched a kingdom unravel without raising his voice. Born in 1421, Henry VI became King of England and France before his first birthday. Yes, a baby king of two nations, a situation only monarchs, fairy tales, and tax accountants could dream up. The Hundred Years' War was still raging, and his inheritance was as unstable as a three-legged stool on a windy hill. His father, the brilliant and brutal Henry V, had won vast territories and made England seem unstoppable. His son unfortunately inherited none of that fire. Henry VI had a gentle heart, a bookish mind, and a nervous constitution that made him more suited to monastic life than battlefield rule. Still, there's something admirable about Henry's early intentions. He loved peace, hated violence, and tried sincerely to govern with fairness and piety. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, because he believed in education and moral improvement. He read scripture more than strategy. But idealism in a medieval monarch tends to crumble under the weight of reality, and this reality came armed. England's hold on France slipped rapidly under Henry's reign. Joan of Arc's victories revitalized the French cause. By 1453, all English territory in France was lost except Calais and the glorious dual monarchy of England. And France became little more than a historical footnote. People started asking in quieter tones, is the king? All right. That same year, Henry suffered a mental breakdown so severe he remained catatonic for over a year. He didn't speak, move, or recognize anyone, not even the birth of his own son stirred him. Government ground to a halt. A protectorate was established under Richard, Duke of York, an arrangement that worked about as well as asking a fox to guard a henhouse made of bacon. When Henry did recover, he emerged softer than before, if possible. He drifted through his own court like a shadow, whispering prayers, avoiding conflict, and occasionally staring into corners for hours. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, picked up the slack. Fierce, politically savvy, and utterly unamused by her husband's ghost-like approach to kingship, she took the reins and then promptly drove the country straight into the Wars of the Roses. Quirky tidbit 1. Henry was so pacifist that he reportedly refused to eat meat because he couldn't bear the thought of killing animals. Instead, he fasted obsessively and donated large sums to monasteries. Some contemporaries found this saintly. Others called it staggeringly unhelpful in a time of war. Quirky tidbit 2. He had a deep fear of loud noises. Bells, drums, shouting, anything sudden or sharp sent him into a dazed retreat. One chronicler claimed that during a council meeting, a dropped goblet caused the king to crawl under the table and remain there for nearly half an hour, as Margaret and the nobles fought in his name, and sometimes in spite of it, the kingdom fell into chaos. Battles erupted across the countryside, St. Albans, Towton Barnet. Henry was captured, deposed, restored, and deposed again like a puppet in a particularly violent play. At one point he was imprisoned in the Tower of London while Edward IV claimed the throne. The once king sat quietly in his cell, writing poetry and offering prayers for his enemies. In 1471, during a brief return of Edward IV, Henry was conveniently found dead in the tower. The official report claimed death by melancholy. More likely, a dagger in the dark. Either way, Henry's reign ended not with a bang, but a sigh, and yet some saw in Henry a kind of quiet sainthood. Miracles were attributed to him after death. Pilgrims visited his tomb. He was remembered not as a tyrant or failure, but as a tragic figure swallowed by forces far stronger than he ever was. You leave his court now, stepping over rose petals and broken oaths. The silence stretches behind you, soft and solemn. But up ahead, the quiet dies. Drunken laughter cracked goblets, and the sudden clatter of boots mark the approach of a king whose crown tilted toward debauchery and forgetfulness. You're not returning to France's glory days. You're walking straight into the court of good King Wenceslaus, who, spoiler alert, wasn't that good after all. The sun sets with a heavy orange slouch over Bohemia. You pass under low archways and into a city square where the stones remember everything. The scent of stale beer and singed parchment still lingers in the air. A troubadour strums an off-key lute in a corner, hoping for a coin and avoiding eye contact with the guards. You've arrived in Prague, and the man in charge, King Wenceslaus, is probably passed out in his private bath again. Now, before you clutch your sleepy heart and picture the good King Wenceslaus from the Christmas Carol, let's be clear that was a different Wenceslaus. That one was Duke of Bohemia in the 10th century and was later canonized as a saint. Our guy, not a saint. Not close. This Wenceslaus reigned in the late 14th and early 15th centuries and spent more time drinking, arguing, and napping than governing. Born in 1361, Wenceslaus IV was the son of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, and one of the most respected rulers in medieval Europe. Big shoes to fill. But Wenceslaus, instead of stepping into them, threw them at his servants during drunken fits. While his father built universities and negotiated treaties, Wenceslaus built beer cellars and insulted nobles. At first, people tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just young, misunderstood, creatively eccentric. But when he skipped important meetings to go fishing or showed up to audiences in a wine-stained tunic, muttering about conspiracy theories, the patience wore thin. He was crowned King of Bohemia and King of the Romans, which was the step before becoming Holy Roman Emperor. Spoiler alert, he never made it that far. Wenceslaus had the political instincts of a sleepy hedgehog and the diplomatic skills of a goose with head trauma. His reign was marked by indifference, corruption, and near-constant rebellion. The nobility hated him. The clergy distrusted him. Even his own advisors were known to roll their eyes during court sessions. Quirky tidbit 1. He kept a menagerie of exotic birds in his palace and once delayed an entire state council because one of his parrots had a cold. Another time he demanded his falcon be addressed formally as Sir Wuffles. Court documents show no record of anyone objecting. Quirky tidbit 2. Wenceslaus reportedly had a taste for alchemical elixirs, many of which were essentially herbal wines spiked with questionable roots and possibly mercury. After drinking them, he would lock himself in his chambers for days, claiming to be receiving visions from the sky under the earth, whatever that means. But his neglect wasn't harmless. Under his reign, the kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war. Nobles took up arms against him multiple times. In 1394, he was even kidnapped by his own nobles, imprisoned, and forced to negotiate his own partial abdication. That's not your average bad day. That's your coworkers held a coup in the break room kind of day. The Holy Roman Empire eventually had enough. In 1400, he was officially deposed as King of the Romans by the electors, citing incapacity. That's medieval code for this guy is asleep at the wheel and also possibly drunk. Back in Bohemia, things weren't much better. Wenceslaus fumbled his way through religious upheaval, including the early seeds of the Hussite movement, which sought to reform the church and give communion in both kinds to the laity, a huge deal at the time. His erratic behavior and inability to navigate this religious crisis helped fuel unrest that would explode into war not long after his death. And yet, despite everything, he refused to relinquish power. He hung on as King of Bohemia until he died in 1419, collapsing in his hunting lodge after a long bath and allegedly a longer bottle of wine. Was he evil? Not really. Wenceslaus didn't massacre his subjects or build prisons of despair, but his legacy was one of wasted potential neglect and missed chances. He ruled a kingdom that needed vision and got naps, a realm hungry for reform and given another round of ale. You step away from Prague's winding alleys now, the echoes of careless laughter and slurred decrees fading behind you. There's something almost peaceful about Wenceslaus's failure. He didn't destroy the world, just let it fray around the edges, thread by golden thread. Ahead, though, comes no such gentleness. You're heading south into the lands of the Fatimids, where a ruler waits who burned books, banned grapes, and howled at the moon. If Wenceslaus was lazy, the next king is lunatic lightning in human form. The heat hits you like a whispered warning. You've left the gray mists of Europe behind and arrived in medieval Cairo, where the stones are sun-baked and the shadows smell of myrrh, jasmine, and burning paper. Minarets rise like fingers pointing toward heaven, and beneath them walks a man no one dares speak against because the moment they do, he might ban sugar or shoes, or possibly their existence. Welcome to the reign of Al-Hakim, Biamr Allah, the Fatimid Caliph, who ruled from 996 to 1021 and left behind a trail of edicts, paranoia, and lunar madness so intense it reads like a surrealist novella. Al-Hakim became caliph at just 11 years old, ascending to power after the death of his father. Early in his rule, things looked promising. He studied religious law-supported scholarship and reigned during a time of relative prosperity. But slowly, perhaps even predictably, the order unraveled. By his 20s, al-Hakim was issuing decrees so baffling and erratic that chroniclers began leaving margins in their texts just to jot down their disbelief. Let's start simple. Al-Hakim hated grapes, not because of allergies or bad wine, but because he decided they were evil. He banned them. All grapes, which meant no wine already outlawed, no raisins, and no eating fruit in public that resembled grapes too closely. He also banned shellfish mulukia, a beloved Egyptian stew, and at one point, chess. Yes, chess. Too stimulating, apparently. Then there were the more personal bans. No cobblers were allowed to make women's shoes with high soles because elevated heels led to sin. He forbade women from leaving their homes at all, to the point that even dogs were not allowed in public, lest they distract or tempt women from their cloistered seclusion. His own sister was once severely punished for simply watching the city from her palace window. Quirky tidbit 1. Al-Hakim had citywide curfews set to lunar phases. On nights of the full moon, people were forbidden from leaving their homes. When asked why, he allegedly responded, "Because they think better under moonlight, and that's dangerous." Quirky tidbit 2. He issued a decree that sunlight was immodest and ordered all shops and businesses to operate at night. Cairo under his rule became a shadow city, markets bustling at midnight, sermons whispered at dawn, and scholars squinting under torchlight while discussing banned books they could no longer find. And oh, the books! Al-Hakim had a love-hate relationship with knowledge. He funded libraries, then burned them. He founded colleges, then outlawed their teachings. At one point, he ordered the destruction of all copies of Aristotle's Metaphysics, claiming the book undermined religious order. Historians still argue whether this was censorship or a case of royal insomnia turned philosophical, but perhaps the most devastating act of his reign came in 1009, when he ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, one of Christianity's holiest sites. The act shocked the Christian world and is often cited as one of the many long-term sparks that would contribute to the Crusades nearly a century later. Was he mad? Dangerous. A misunderstood reformer? Historians remain divided. Some argue al-Hakim was suffering from a serious mental illness. His mood swings, bizarre logic, and obsessive control certainly point to it. Others suggest his actions were calculated displays of power, a method of keeping enemies and citizens alike in a state of confusion and fear. After all, if your laws are unpredictable, your rules becomes unchallengeable. You can't rebel against what you can't anticipate. And then suddenly he vanished. In 1021, al-Hakim rode out alone into the Mokattam Hills on a nighttime walk and never returned. His donkey came back. He didn't. Some say he was assassinated by political rivals. Others say he faked his death and became a hidden imam watching from the shadows. A sect known as the Druze even came to believe he was divine and would return again. To this day, no one has conclusively solved the mystery. You walk now through the nighttime silence of Fatimid Cairo, every lantern throwing sharp angles across shuttered stalls and cautious eyes. The city has long since woken from his dream, but somewhere you swear you can still hear a man laughing under the stars, muttering about shoelaces and soup. Up next, though, Europe again. But this time, we're going deep into a royal family tree with too few branches. One king, all the chromosomes, and not nearly enough good decisions. The tapestry of Europe now tightens, weaving itself into a knot of ancestry and affliction. You step through velvet-lined halls lit by flickering candlelight, and somewhere perhaps too close you hear the rasp of labored breathing and the dull thump of footsteps dragging unevenly across stone. This is the court of Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, and known to history by a title more tragic than cruel, the Bewitched. At first the palace appears regal enough. Gilded walls, Flemish tapestries, marble busts of ancient Habsburg glory. But look closer and things don't quite align. The guards shift uncomfortably. Servants speak in murmurs. And at the far end of the hall, seated upon a grand throne, is a man with a massive jaw, a vacant stare, and a legacy that whispers like a curse. Charles II was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, and his life reads like the ultimate cautionary tale of royal inbreeding. His family tree, rather than branching outward, looped in on itself like a curling vine. His parents were uncle and niece. His great-grandparents were cousins. His gene pool was less a pool and more a puddle. And the result, Charles was born with mandibular prognathism, a jaw so enlarged and misaligned that he could barely chew food. He didn't walk until age 8. He didn't speak clearly until nearly 10. His spine was twisted, his immune system fragile, and his mind clouded by episodes of confusion, depression, and what we'd now likely call neurological dysfunction. By the time he reached adulthood, if you can call it that, his body had aged like damp parchment. Yet he was king, and not of some sleepy province, but of a vast global empire. Spain under Charles ruled Naples, the Low Countries, parts of the Americas, and more. And at the center of this collapsing imperial star map was a man who often forgot where he was and once asked whether his deceased wife would be joining him for supper. She wouldn't. She'd been dead for months. Quirky tidbit 1. Charles II was obsessed with exorcisms. He believed himself possessed, cursed, or enchanted by dark magic. At various times he invited monks to chant over him, drink potions, or apply strange ointments to his body in hopes of driving the demons out. One ritual involved burying a holy relic under his bed. Another had a priest shout Latin verses into his ear for an entire night. Neither helped. Quirky tidbit 2. He kept a team of court necromancers, yes, necromancers, on retainer. Not official ones, of course, but clandestine spiritual advisors who promised to contact the dead or reveal the cause of his ailments. One famously claimed that Charles's body was full of worms of the soul. Not exactly medical diagnosis, but it fit the mood. Historians still argue how much of Charles's behavior was due to physical illness, psychological trauma, or simply the relentless expectation to be a king when you were barely functioning as a person. His court was a circus of manipulation. Ministers jockeyed for power, often running the country, while Charles nodded blankly or insisted on hearing the same reports over and over again, as if he'd forgotten them the first time. Spoiler he had. As his health declined, the question of succession loomed large. Charles had no children, his marriages were unconsummated, or in one case ended when his bride fled the country in tears. The result was a succession crisis that would explode into the War of the Spanish Succession, dragging most of Europe into a bloody contest over who got to inherit the empire after Charles. In his final years, Charles was barely present. He could not eat without assistance. He could not walk unassisted. He could not rule in any real sense. And yet the court still surrounded him with pomp and ritual, dressing him daily, placing a crown upon his head, pretending that the king still lived while his mind flickered like a dying candle. He died in 1700 at the age of 38, though his body seemed decades older. His autopsy, recorded in grim and clinical detail, noted a withered heart, rotted lungs, enlarged skull, and no blood in his body. Whether those accounts were exaggerated or medically plausible is debatable, but the symbolism was apt. Charles II was a king undone by centuries of lineage turned in on itself. And as you step out of his shadow, you don't feel fear so much as fatigue. This wasn't tyranny. It was the slow collapse of a dynasty played out in silent illness, and the mournful echo of bells no longer rung. Ahead, England once again. A different kind of disaster, less medical, more melodramatic. A young king with too much ego, too little foresight, and a tendency to turn every decision into a theatrical production. You return to England, but this time the air is charged not with menace, but with melodrama. Trumpets blare too loudly. Velvet drapes billow in the breeze with almost comical theatricality. And on the throne, swathed in gold and scowling at his reflection in a gilded mirror, sits King Richard II, boy king, patron of poetry and lover of elaborate entrances. If past kings were terrifying, cruel, or incompetent, Richard is something stranger theater in human form. Born in 1367 and crowned at 10 years old, after the death of his grandfather Edward III, and his father, the Black Prince Richard, began life as a child monarch in a kingdom barely keeping it together. England was in the midst of the Hundred Years' War. With France, the peasants' revolt was bubbling, and the nobility couldn't agree on what day it was, let alone how to run a country. Into this tangle stepped Richard Young, idealistic and oddly obsessed with ceremonial splendor. The early years weren't all terrible. At 14, during the height of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, Richard rode out alone to meet thousands of angry rebels. It's one of his most impressive moments. He spoke calmly, promised reforms, and convinced the crowd to stand down, only for his advisors to break those promises, almost immediately leading to further violence. Still, that early bravery gave people hope. And then he grew up. By his 20s, Richard II saw himself less as a king and more as a divine performer, God's anointed set apart from the grubby squabbling of the barons. He surrounded himself with sycophants, threw banquets that made Versailles look minimalist, and commissioned paintings that depicted him as a haloed figure above his trembling subjects. He was the first English king to have himself depicted holding an orb and scepter, in full regalia on royal seals, not because he had to, but because he liked the vibe. Historians still argue whether Richard was suffering from narcissism delusion or just very bad taste in friends. Either way, things got weird fast. He enacted harsh policies to punish dissent, including revoking charters, imposing enormous fines, and exiling or executing rivals under flimsy charges of treason. His revenge wasn't explosive, it was bureaucratic. A slow tightening of the noose made of scroll seals and very smug decrees. Quirky tidbit. One Richard was obsessed with cleanliness and scented gloves. He reportedly changed clothes multiple times a day and insisted on fresh herbs being scattered in every room he entered. At one banquet, he had roses pinned to his dining chair and refused to eat until the tablecloth had been scented with orange water. Quirky tidbit 2. He designed his own mobile throne, which could be packed up and carried around the kingdom, so he could always reign from a proper seat. Yes, even on campaign. No one else was allowed to sit on it, and it had gold-embroidered cushions and armrests shaped like griffins. Very practical. Very... Despite his flair for performance, Richard alienated nearly everyone. His heavy-handed control of Parliament, reckless spending, and constant demands for loyalty made him deeply unpopular. The nobles whispered, the commoners grumbled, and eventually his cousin Henry Bolingbroke decided enough was enough. While Richard was in Ireland on one of his theatrical military escapades, Bolingbroke returned to England, rallied the nobles, and seized power with minimal resistance. When Richard came back, he found himself not welcomed, but arrested. He was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle and forced to abdicate in 1399. His crown was given to Bolingbroke, now Henry IV. What happened next remains one of history's open debates. Richard either died from starvation murder, or a bit of both. Some accounts say he was purposefully neglected, others that he refused food out of pride or despair. One colorful chronicle suggests he was struck with a poker during an argument with his jailers. Whatever the method, Richard II faded quietly into legend. Ironically, his fall became the stuff of true drama. William Shakespeare later turned Richard's life into a poetic tragedy, The Tragedy of King Richard II, full of soliloquies, hubris, and political backstabbing. In death, Richard finally got the theatrical climax he'd always wanted. You leave his chamber now, careful not to touch the silk drapes or disturb the ghostly scent of rosewater still lingering in the corridors. The last flicker of candlelight catches on a discarded mirror cracked. Up ahead is Sweden, a kingdom of forest lakes and chilled indifference. And a king who made apathy an art form, forgetting not just birthdays and treaties, but entire wars. You step out into the crisp air of the north, where the pine trees lean in like curious eavesdroppers and the lakes lie still as glass. This is Sweden, stoic, silent, and vast. But don't let the calm fool you. Somewhere in this wide, frosted expanse sits a king so forgetful, so alarmingly indifferent, that he once lost his throne, his wife, and possibly his pig, all in the same week. Welcome to the era of King Valdemar IV of Sweden, sometimes called Valdemar the Forgetful, and not without reason. Now, to be fair, Valdemar wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't cruel or bloodthirsty. He didn't execute dozens of nobles or ban daylight. No, his reign was less defined by malice and more by persistent, almost magical incompetence. It's like someone gave a lost tourist a crown and forgot to tell him what it was for. Born in the early 1230s and crowned king in 1250, Valdemar's reign began with hope. He came from the influential House of Bjelbo, and his early rule was supported by his capable father Birger Jarl, one of the most powerful men in Swedish history. So technically, Valdemar started out more as a ceremonial figurehead while his dad ran the country. A strong strategy until Birger died and Valdemar was left to govern by himself. That's when things started slipping. First treaties went unsigned, letters unanswered, armies uncoordinated. Valdemar had the unique gift of doing nothing at all and still somehow offending everyone. The clergy hated him for ignoring church appointments. The nobles resented his chronic indecision, and the Danish court despised him because, well, he forgot his own marriage alliance. Yes, Valdemar had married a Danish princess, Sophia of Denmark, which in theory should have cemented peace between the two kingdoms. But instead he embarked on a passionate and very public affair with Sophia's sister, Jutta. This was not subtle. Chronicles describe games and revels in the royal bedchamber, with the queen left to stew in polite Danish fury. Quirky tidbit 1. According to a legend that is absolutely real and not at all made up by a bored monk, Valdemar once gifted a monastery a pig, and then 2 years later tried to steal it back, claiming he'd never meant to donate it. The monastery responded by excommunicating him over a pig. Quirky tidbit 2. He attempted to reorganize Sweden's coinage system but forgot to actually inform anyone. For months, two currencies circulated, both claiming to be official. Confusion reigned. Bakers refused payment in the wrong silver. Markets crashed. It was like introducing monopoly money to a fragile economy and insisting it was a test. By 1275, things had reached a breaking point. His brothers Magnus and Eric had grown tired of his absent-minded approach to leadership. They launched a rebellion, citing his mismanagement, moral failure, and general forgetfulness. At the Battle of Hova, Valdemar's forces were defeated. He was deposed, imprisoned, and replaced by his brother Magnus. But Valdemar wasn't finished just yet. After escaping, prison details remain vague, possibly involving bribery or someone leaving the door unlocked. Valdemar tried to reclaim the throne multiple times. None of his attempts were successful. One was so poorly planned that his forces attacked a town by accident, thinking it was the capital. It wasn't even close. Eventually, he gave up, went into exile, and spent his remaining years wandering between courts in Denmark and Norway, constantly petitioning for support, rarely getting it, and once trying to sue for the return of land that he had, in fact, never owned. Still, not all was failure. Valdemar had several children, and his lineage continued to hold noble titles. He even retained a ceremonial status in some documents, referred to respectfully as former king, long after it had stopped meaning anything. And perhaps there's something almost soothing about him. In a world of violent, vengeful monarchs, Valdemar was simply absent. Mentally, emotionally, strategically. He drifted through kingship like a leaf in a slow-moving stream, occasionally bumping into things, occasionally forgetting who he was bumping into. As you walk away from his faded castle, the wind picks up, carrying the faint scent of peat fires and forgotten feast. Somewhere in the distance, a pig snorts indignantly. You don't ask questions, but the calm won't last. The next king awaits in France again. He's serious, stern, a planner. But beneath his precise exterior burns a cold fire, one that burns books, buries knights, and defies even the Pope. You descend into France again, this time beneath skies the color of smelted iron and rain that seems to fall with a certain grim finality. The land feels rigid, ordered, but brittle. And at the center of it all is a king who wore precision like armor and wielded cold authority like a scalpel. Welcome to the court of Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, but don't let the nickname fool you. Fair referred to his looks, not his methods. Born in 1268 and crowned in 1285, Philip IV didn't foam at the mouth or throw fits. He didn't giggle at prophecies or name his dog Chancellor. He ruled like a stone statue might, unblinking, silent, and always watching. In fact, one chronicler said he had the face of a statue and the soul to match. If past kings made bad decisions loudly, Philip made efficiently ruthless ones in a whisper. He modernized France's administration, expanded royal power, and made clever use of the legal system to crush enemies. But it's the scale of his consequences that earned him a place in our midnight procession of monarchs. Let's begin with his obsession money. Philip needed it. Wars are expensive. Governance is expensive. Lavish capes trimmed in sable, very expensive. But rather than raise taxes on the nobility who might fight back, Philip took aim elsewhere, specifically the Knights Templar and the Jews of France. In 1306, Philip expelled the entire Jewish population of France, seizing their assets and canceling debts owed to them. One day they were part of French commerce and society. The next they were branded stripped of property and cast out. It was efficient, brutal, and economically convenient. But the Templars, that was his masterpiece. The Knights Templar were a powerful monastic military order, rich from centuries of crusading and banking. They had land, gold, and influence. Philip owed them money, a lot of money. So he decided to erase the debt by erasing the Templars. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, in a sweep worthy of modern intelligence agencies, Philip ordered the arrest of every Templar in France. Charges included heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross, and performing unspeakable rituals involving cats. Many of these charges were fabricated, fed to prisoners under torture. Confessions were signed under duress. And yet it worked. Quirky tidbit 1. Philip personally oversaw the interrogation transcripts. He didn't trust his inquisitors to get the wording right, so he had summaries sent to him daily like medieval email chains, but with more screaming and fewer gifs. Quirky tidbit 2. He once taxed the clergy so aggressively that Pope Boniface VIII issued a bull condemning the action. Philip responded by accusing the Pope of witchcraft and sodomy, had him kidnapped, and, according to some accounts, may have beaten him so badly during captivity that he died shortly after being released. Yes, you heard that right. He basically bullied a pope to death. Historians still argue whether Philip's attack on the Templars was driven by genuine belief in their heresy or pure greed. The result either way was decisive. The order was dissolved, its wealth seized, and its leaders executed. Most famously, Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in 1314. As the flames rose, he reportedly cursed both Philip and Pope Clement by calling them to divine judgment before the year ended. And here's the eerie bit, they both died within the year. This led to centuries of legend about the curse of the Templars, which many claimed haunted Philip's line. His sons all ruled briefly, but each died without lasting heirs. The Capetian dynasty, which had held the French throne for 3 centuries, collapsed within a generation. Coincidence, probably. But at midnight under rain like this, you start to wonder. You step carefully now through the corridors of Philip's palace, the stones worn smooth by efficient boots. There's no laughter here, no stained glass saints, no stray pigs. Just legal parchments, wax seals, and the echo of justice that sounds a lot like vengeance. Philip wasn't mad. He wasn't incompetent. He was terrifyingly competent. And yet, from the cold ashes of his legacy, something more chaotic will emerge. Another Wenceslaus. But worse. Less stability, more dogs. Less logic, more drunken threats. Prepare yourself for the king of moods is next. The air thickens again, not with incense or fog, but with something altogether more pungent, spilled beer, wet fur, and political failure. You're back in the Holy Roman Empire now, winding through the hills of Bohemia, where the court is less a place of government and more a room full of muttering nobles trying to avoid the king's mood swings. Meet Wenceslaus IV, the second monarch of that name on our journey, and somehow incredibly worse than the first. Born in 1361 and crowned King of Bohemia in 1363, yes, at just 2 years old, Wenceslaus had the advantage of early exposure to royalty. Unfortunately, what he absorbed wasn't grace or diplomacy, it was a fondness for ale animals and increasingly theatrical outbursts. He became King of the Romans in 1376, meant to succeed his father Charles IV as Holy Roman Emperor. Instead, he became an emperor in waiting who mostly didn't show up to things. Where Charles IV was intelligent, methodical, and deeply concerned with the health of the empire, Wenceslaus was asleep, or absent, or hunting with his dogs, and sometimes drunk. Frequently all three. The imperial nobility quickly grew restless. He failed to attend Reichstag meetings. He ignored disputes between vassals. He even forgot to send military aid during major conflicts. One time, an entire city burned down while Wenceslaus was composing a ballad about his favorite mastiff. The dog's name, Ludwig. The ballad lost sadly. Quirky tidbit 1: Wenceslaus adored dogs and not in the normal royal way. He allowed them to sleep in his chambers, sit in on council meetings, and even sign treaties with paw prints. Some chroniclers swear a border agreement with Saxony bore the muddy impression of a spaniel's foot beside the king's seal. Quirky tidbit 2: He once ordered a bishop imprisoned in a wine cellar for arguing with him. The bishop spent a week locked in a barrel storage room, while Wenceslaus delivered meals personally, along with sermons about loyalty and increasingly incoherent threats. By the 1390s, the emperor's absenteeism had become a crisis. The German princes formally deposed him in 1400, declaring him unfit to lead. His reaction? Shrug. He refused to step down but also didn't fight to reclaim the role. Instead, he returned to Bohemia and doubled down on sulking drinking and writing poetry that nobody read. At this point, Bohemia itself was starting to crack. Religious reformers like Jan Hus were preaching powerful sermons about church corruption, national identity, and social justice. Wenceslaus ignored it all until it boiled over. When Hus was condemned and eventually burned at the stake, riots erupted. Towns split into factions. The Hussite Wars began shortly after Wenceslaus's death, but his utter inability to mediate or even acknowledge the unrest helped light the fuse. And yet he stayed on the throne in Bohemia until 1419. Why? Mostly because he didn't make enough decisions to provoke immediate rebellion. His brand of failure was passive, a kind of slow rot rather than explosive destruction. In his later years, Wenceslaus became more reclusive. He'd lock himself in his hunting lodges, surrounded by dogs, barrels of wine, and an increasingly small circle of flatterers. He distrusted priests, nobles, even his own cooks. One courtier wrote that the king refused to eat food unless it was tasted first by a hound and then blessed by a silent monk. He died in 1419, possibly from a stroke, possibly from falling down drunk after shouting at a chimney. The records are vague. The reaction from the Bohemian people was equally unclear. Some mourned him. Most simply moved on like someone waking from a nap and wondering why the room smells like wet hay and disappointment. Wenceslaus IV left behind a kingdom on the brink of civil war, a court full of animals, and a historical record so patchy it reads more like a collection of rumors than a reign. Still, there's something almost gentle in his brand of awfulness. He wasn't cruel, just woefully unqualified and possibly more interested in dog treats than treaties. You step away from his throne, a lopsided chair stained with mead, and pass into a darker hall now. The next monarch wasn't a napper or a dreamer. He was something worse, completely indifferent to disaster. And as barbarians marched on Rome, he mourned, Not the city, but something smaller, feathery, and named Rome. The dust is dry here. You feel it in your throat, your boots, your thoughts. The light is brighter, too thin, sharp, almost intrusive. You've arrived in Ravenna, the last imperial capital of the West, where the empire that once commanded continents now rules over squabbling bureaucrats, forgotten statues, and an emperor who cares more about poultry than politics. This is the strange and anticlimactic tale of Emperor Honorius, ruler of the Western Roman Empire, from 395 to 423 AD, and arguably one of the most gloriously useless monarchs to ever wear a diadem. Let's set the scene. The Western Roman Empire is cracking. Not just politically, but spiritually, militarily, economically, every seam is coming undone. The Visigoths are stirring in the east. Vandals press through Gaul. The legions are thin and underpaid. The treasury is hollow. And standing calmly in the middle of it all is a man who quite literally believes the sack of Rome means that his pet chicken has died. Yes, you heard that correctly. Honorius, born in 384 to the powerful Theodosius, was crowned emperor of the Western Empire at the tender age of 10. Not because he was brilliant, not because he showed promise, but because he was his father's son, and in Roman dynastic fashion that was more than enough. But little Honorius was no young Augustus. Even in youth, he preferred quiet to command routine to risk. He grew up sheltered, shuttled between palaces, and was trained to recite prayers, not rally troops. Upon his father's death, the empire was split in two. Arcadius ruled the east, Honorius the west. Arcadius wasn't exactly a dynamo either, but compared to Honorius, he was practically Julius Caesar with a planner and a protein shake. For the first several years of his reign, Honorius depended heavily on his regent and general Stilicho, a capable commander who fought off barbarian incursions and managed imperial affairs, while Honorius did, well, it's hard to say. He liked birds. He watched races. He probably sighed a lot. Stilicho's success kept the Western Empire afloat longer than it had any right to be. But things changed. Honorius, jealous or manipulated or both, turned on Stilicho in 408. The general was arrested and executed. The army, stunned and now leaderless, began to unravel. Into this power vacuum marched Alaric, leader of the Visigoths, who demanded recognition, land, and gold. Honorius said no. Alaric asked again. Honorius refused again. Then in 410 it happened, the sack of Rome. For the first time in 800 years, the Eternal City was breached. The Visigoths poured into its gates, looting, burning, and shaking the Roman psyche to its core. Statues fell, basilicas burned, slaves fled, senators wept. But in Ravenna, Honorius, hundreds of miles away, was utterly unmoved. According to one 6th century account by Procopius, probably apocryphal, but too delightful not to share, a court official burst into Honorius's chamber to break the news Rome has perished. Honorius gasped, apparently stricken. "But she was just eating from my hand this morning," the courtier, confused, clarified. "Not your chicken, the city." Honorius blinked. "Oh, that's too bad," he replied and returned to his meal. Historians still argue whether this anecdote is metaphor or reality, though let's be honest, does it really matter? It captures the essence of Honorius, a man detached, disinterested, and utterly incapable of grasping the scale of what was happening around him. Quirky tidbit 1. Honorius had an elaborate burial plan for his chickens. He named them after Roman provinces. He commissioned tiny marble urns. One bird, Numidia, reportedly had a dedicated eulogy composed by a palace poet. While his legions begged for reinforcements in Gaul, Honorius was busy selecting proper inscriptions for a hen's grave. Quirky tidbit 2. He spent an unusual amount of time redesigning his imperial wardrobe, particularly in his later years. While the treasury dried up and tax collectors were murdered in the provinces, Honorius hosted court debates over whether his tunic hem should be bordered in gold thread or imperial purple. A compromise was reached. He wore both. If Wenceslaus IV governed like a man distracted by dogs, Honorius ruled like a man trying to pretend his empire was a quiet garden where nothing unpleasant ever happened. His solution to every problem was either to stall delegate or simply move the court farther away. Ravenna became his refuge, a swampy, mosquito-ridden backwater surrounded by marshes chosen because it was hard to invade, yes, but also because it allowed him to be left alone. But the empire wouldn't leave him alone. After Rome's sack barbarian groups carved out territories across Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, Britain, left to fend for itself, declared independence in everything but name. Honorius issued strongly worded letters declaring these acts illegal. The barbarians, one imagines, politely declined to care. Meanwhile, usurpers popped up like dandelions. Constantine III declared himself emperor in Britain, crossed into Gaul, and actually accomplished more in 2 years than Honorius did in a decade. Other generals rebelled, were declared traitors, and then re-promoted when it was politically convenient. Honorius handled these crises with the grace of a man trying to swat flies using a feather pillow. His one consistent policy: do nothing until it's too late, then try to blame someone else. He exiled advisors on flimsy charges. He signed treaties he didn't understand. He mourned cities only after they'd burned to ash, and he rarely left the palace unless it was to escape the scent of a particularly pungent fish stew. And yet, somehow the Western Empire limped on. Not thanks to Honorius, but in spite of him. Local governors improvised. Border commanders forged their own pacts with barbarian tribes. Economies shrank, taxes collapsed, but society persisted. The Western Roman Empire didn't explode under Honorius, it quietly sagged like a grand but rotting sofa. When Honorius died in 423 of edema, likely brought on by years of sedentary living and mild dismay, he left behind no heirs, no vision, and no real plan. His reign had lasted 30 years. A miracle, really, if you consider he spent most of it doing very little. The empire lurched forward for a few more decades, but many mark his death as the point where the Western Roman world began to fade for real. His legacy: a footnote, a joke. A man remembered not for what he did, but for what he didn't do, and that's everything. And yet, you can't help but feel a strange kind of sleepy affection. Honorius wasn't malevolent. He didn't kill his own son, burn heretics, or drown his kingdom in blood. He just ignored it all like a child covering his ears while the walls fall in. He ruled in the way a houseplant might rule a presence, a name, a silence. And sometimes silence is the loudest sign of decline. You step out now into the marsh air of Ravenna, the last firelight of empire flickering in the dark. You hear no horns, no marches, just the soft cooing of distant birds, perhaps echoing in a palace long since claimed by moss. Ahead lies France again, but not the shining Capetian throne, nor the blood-slick battlefield of kings. No, this next monarch is a side character in his own reign. A man known not for ruling, but for sneezing too hard and dying immediately after. You're back in France now, drifting through an age blurred by whispers and lineage charts so tangled they might as well have been woven by cats. The crown you follow is not atop a triumphant warrior or cunning politician, but perched precariously on the head of a man, so faint, so utterly undefined that his brief reign exists mostly in margins. This is Louis II of France, also called Louis the Stammerer, a king whose life was a series of skipped lines, mumbled decrees, and if some accounts are to be believed, one fatal sneeze. He reigned for only 2 years, two quiet, delicate, vaguely disappointing years from 877 to 879. But if this history of terrible monarchs has taught you anything, it's that incompetence isn't measured in years served. It's measured in how badly you fumbled what little you were handed. Let's rewind. Louis was born in 846, the son of Charles the Bald. Yes, that Charles, the twitchy king you met back in Section 2, who possibly wasn't bald at all, but was definitely exhausted. Charles, for all his failings, managed to maintain some semblance of control in a kingdom, constantly chewing on its own limbs. When he died in 877, the crown passed to Louis, who had spent his life in his father's shadow, coughing into linen sleeves and reciting court poetry with the trembling voice of a man constantly on the verge of apologizing. Louis XVI wasn't aggressive. He wasn't bold. He didn't even stammer in the way Hollywood might imagine. His nickname, Le Bègue, described a hesitancy of speech, a nervousness that infected not just his voice, but his entire presence. Chroniclers describe him as a good man, a moral man, a soft man. And when you're king in the 9th century, softness is less a virtue than a royal liability. Upon ascending the throne, Louis immediately split his time between trying to please his barons and avoiding them entirely. France at the time wasn't really a nation. It was a loose agglomeration of squabbling duchies, Viking-battered coastlines, and opportunistic counts. Louis needed to assert power, centralize control, maybe wage a strategic war or two. Instead, he held a few councils, issued some vague charters, and then got distracted by illness. Reports suggest he suffered from a combination of respiratory infections, fever, and a constitutional weakness that today might be called chronic fatigue or possibly deep reluctance. Quirky tidbit 1. Louis was obsessed with singing monks. He once summoned an entire Benedictine choir from Tours to perform daily hymns outside his window. The problem? They had to walk nearly 50 miles in the mud. By the time they arrived, half of them were limping, and several had quit the clergy out of spite. Quirky tidbit 2. He believed that wearing fur from different animals caused spiritual confusion. He reportedly banned his courtiers from mixing ermine with fox, citing divine disapproval. One duke, unaware of the rule, entered court with a two-tone cape and was sent home immediately barefoot. Yet despite all this, despite being a king who ruled less like a monarch and more like a visiting cousin, staying too long, Louis still managed to father multiple children. His first wife, Ansgard of Burgundy, bore him 2 sons, Louis and Carloman. Yes, really Carloman, not a misprint. But Louis the Stammerer then annulled the marriage and took up with the noblewoman named Adelaide, causing a minor scandal and a major inheritance crisis that would plague the royal court for years. And then he sneezed. No, truly. Contemporary records describe his death as sudden, and several link it to a violent sneeze during a nighttime prayer session. Whether the sneeze caused a heart attack, burst a blood vessel, or was simply a euphemism for something less absurd, the moment stuck. One monk wrote that the Lord took him at the moment of exhalation. Others suggest the sneeze wasn't fatal in itself, but that Louis, in a panic, believed it was lay down and refused to rise again, convinced he was dying. He wasn't until several days later when he actually died. Historians still argue over the cause. Was it pneumonia stroke? A nervous breakdown caused by court politics and too much fox fur? What's clear is that his passing left France in a state of deep uncertainty. His sons were underage, his nobles uncooperative, and his succession plan, like much of his reign, was unfinished. After his death, the kingdom was divided between Louis III and Carloman II. The brothers ruled uneasily, mostly from separate palaces, and accomplished little before both died young, neither leaving heirs. It was as though the throne had become a cursed chair. Sit in it, and you vanish within a few years. Louis the Stammerer's real legacy wasn't in action, but in absence. He ruled at a time when the Carolingian Empire, once mighty under Charlemagne, was visibly sagging. His predecessors had lost chunks of territory. Louis simply failed to notice. While Viking ships continued to ply the rivers, burning abbeys and looting towns, Louis was writing polite letters to bishops and commissioning new psalms in honor of peace. But peace in his case meant inaction. Not diplomacy, not strategy, just the belief that if he were very still and very quiet, the storm would pass. It didn't. France under Louis became a realm of hesitant gestures and half-finished thoughts. His court, though not violent, was fragile. He delegated most matters of state to advisors and clerics, some of whom were loyal and some of whom were literally illiterate. One legend describes a royal charter being sealed upside down because the scribe couldn't read Latin and was too afraid to ask. And yet he was beloved quietly. The people didn't fear him, didn't hate him. They just forgot him. Which for a king is possibly the most damning verdict of all. You walk now through the halls of his final residence, passing rooms where prayers once echoed, and fires were kept low for fear of disturbing the royal sinuses. There's no grandeur here, just a sense of unfinished business of history taking a breath and then sneezing. And just like that, Louis is gone. But don't get too comfortable. The next monarch ruled with much more noise. A king so brutally efficient in betrayal that he took sibling rivalry to biblical levels. He didn't forget to govern, he just preferred to govern alone even if it meant spilling royal blood to do it. Now the landscape turns colder, harsh winds curling through dark forests and stone monasteries. You've arrived in the kingdom of Burgundy, where the air always feels a little too quiet, a little too sharp, as if history itself is tiptoeing around something it doesn't want to provoke. Ahead lies a throne few remember, occupied by a man history mostly tries to forget. But we won't, because King Sigismund of Burgundy earns his place in our parade of terrible kings. Not with ignorance or madness, but with betrayal blood and a legacy stained by the very kin he destroyed. Sigismund ruled from 516 to 524 AD. The time period itself is murky. The Roman Empire in the West had collapsed just decades earlier, and much of what was once Gaul was now a tangle of shifting kingdoms and raw ambition. Burgundy, nestled in the region now between eastern France and western Switzerland, was still finding its shape when Sigismund took the crown from his father Gundobad. And that's where the trouble starts. Sigismund was the product of religious contradiction. Born a pagan, he converted to Christianity, specifically Arianism, the flavor of Christianity favored by many Germanic tribes at the time. But later, either due to political pressure or sincere conviction, he converted again, this time to Catholicism, aligning himself with the Church of Rome. It's hard to know how deep his belief went, but what's certain is that he tried very, very hard to prove his loyalty. So hard, in fact, that he became a monk later in life. We'll get there. Sigismund began his reign with the usual mix of diplomacy and sword shaking. He was cautious, calculating, and initially effective. He built churches, he donated to monasteries, he gave alms. He even founded the famous Abbey of Saint-Maurice, which still stands today. For a time, he looked like one of those rare medieval kings who might be decent. Then he murdered his son. Let's pause there. His son Sigeric was the child of Sigismund's first wife. That wife died young, and Sigismund remarried a woman whose name was conveniently left out of most records, a woman whose influence over the king would soon turn catastrophic. She reportedly convinced Sigismund that Sigeric was plotting against him. No hard proof, no army, just whispers. And Sigismund listened. One day, according to the chronicler, Gregory of Tours Sigismund had his son dragged into the royal chamber. After a brief and bitter exchange, one that no one wrote down, Sigismund ordered his son strangled, not beheaded, not executed in combat, strangled like a thief in the night. Quirky tidbit 1: Sigismund personally supervised the burial of his son in the monastery he had founded. He even had masses said for Sigaric's soul, claiming publicly that it had been a terrible mistake. Privately, he never spoke of it again. Quirky tidbit 2: he ordered a 7-day fast across Burgundy in penance, which sounds noble until you realize it was mostly enforced by threatening villagers with floggings if they were caught eating too soon. Monastic grief, it seems, has its limits. Now, medieval kings murdered family members more often than we'd like to think. But Sigismund's killing of Sigaric stood out because it was so needless, so sudden, and crucially because it destabilized the entire kingdom. Sigaric was popular, he had noble allies, and his death sent a ripple through Burgundy's already fragile court. Enter the Franks. The Frankish kings led by Clodomir, one of Clovis's many sons, saw an opportunity. They had long resented Burgundy's independence and Sigismund's claims of divine right. And now, with the king weakened by grief and political fallout, they pounced. In 523, Clodomir and his brothers invaded Burgundy, burning towns, seizing forts, and eventually capturing Sigismund himself. The once king, now shackled and dirt-covered, was dragged before Clodomir's court. He was mocked, paraded, and finally thrown into a well with his wife and children. The Frankish chroniclers describe it almost casually. No drama, no trial. Just an execution like tossing out a broken tool. But Burgundy wasn't conquered entirely. Sigismund's brother Godemar escaped and rallied the Burgundian forces, retaking much of the kingdom. For a brief moment, it looked like the dynasty might survive. Then came Vézérance. The Battle of Vézérance in 524 was brutal. Frankish and Burgundian forces clashed with such intensity that the fields were reportedly soaked in blood for days. Clodomir was killed, possibly decapitated, and the Franks retreated. But the damage was done. Within a generation, Burgundy would be fully absorbed into the Frankish realm. Sigismund's death was the beginning of the end. And how is he remembered? Strangely, as a saint. Yes, a saint. In the centuries after his death, Sigismund's support of monasteries, his late-life repentance, and his martyrdom at the hands of the Franks were reinterpreted by the Church as signs of holiness. His bones were moved to Prague. Pilgrims came. Miracles were reported. And the man who had murdered his own son was venerated, cloaked in incense, and carved into stained glass. Historians still debate this canonization. Some argue it was political, an attempt to unify various Christian sects under a shared symbol. Others believe Sigismund's genuine remorse redeemed him. But whatever the reason, it's hard to reconcile the man who strangled his heir with the man now known as Saint Sigismund, patron of children and headaches. You can't make this up. You leave Burgundy now, its forests echoing with half-sung prayers and the cries of a dynasty unraveling. The well where Sigismund died still exists, though the bones are long gone. What remains is a story of religious obsession, manipulation, and a terrible choice that rippled through generations. Ahead lies the end of our march, a final figure, a king who turned all of England into a game board of civil war, and managed to be so indecisive, so absolutely terrible at decision-making, that no one, not even his own supporters, wanted him to keep the throne. He didn't murder a son. He didn't forget to rule. He simply failed at everything, including dinner manners. And now at last you arrive at the final hall in this long, crumbling gallery of terrible monarchs. The wind over England has changed it, howls less like a war cry and more like a groan. The ground beneath your boots is soft from too many battles. The crown you approach now is dented, tarnished, and sitting atop a man whose name doesn't inspire awe or fear or even much memory, just exhaustion. Welcome to the reign of King Stephen of England. Sovereign of missteps, master of indecision, and architect of one of the most frustrating periods in English history, a time that chroniclers with polite understatement called the Anarchy. Stephen of Blois, born sometime around 1092, wasn't supposed to be king, at least not technically. His cousin Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry IV, had been named heir. Her father had spent years forcing England's barons to swear loyalty to her. But when Henry died in 1135, Matilda was abroad. Stephen was not. He was in England, charming, popular, and most importantly, male. He acted fast. He rushed to London, secured the support of powerful bishops, and got himself crowned with shaky legality and a truly dazzling amount of political backstabbing. Matilda was furious. So were many of the nobles who had pledged to her. Thus began a 19-year war of succession, a kingdom where no one really ruled, no one really won, and everyone got very, very tired. This is Stephen's reign from 1135 to 1154. And oh, what a reign it was. From the start, Stephen showed all the hallmarks of a bad king by contradiction. He wasn't evil. He wasn't insane. He was like Honorius, a profoundly poor decision-maker. He couldn't decide how to enforce law, how to punish disloyalty, or even what city to stay in for more than a few weeks. He wandered, gave contradictory orders, forgave traitors too often, and punished allies for no clear reason. His justice system collapsed. His coinage became debased. His word meant nothing. Quirky tidbit 1. Stephen traveled constantly so erratically that no one could keep track of where the court would be next. Royal documents from his reign often lack a location, just the vague phrase in the field. One scribe noted that Stephen moves as if chased yet by no visible army. Quirky tidbit 2. He once gave away the same castle to two different nobles on the same day. When they both showed up with troops to claim it, Stephen shrugged and left town. The castle burned. The nobles declared feud, and the king sent them each a goose as a peace offering. Really, the country fell into chaos. Barons built unauthorized castles known as adulteran castles all over the countryside. Taxes went uncollected. Bandits roamed freely. Clerics begged for stability only to be ignored or in some cases kidnapped. Chronicler William of Malmesbury famously wrote, "Christ and his saints slept." It wasn't an empire in decline, it was a kingdom sleepwalking through catastrophe. Empress Matilda, for her part, eventually landed in England with troops and supporters. She was fierce, clever, and politically sharp, too sharp it turned out. While she scored several victories, she alienated key allies with her haughty demeanor. At one point, she was preparing for coronation in London when the citizens literally chased her out of the city. The chroniclers say she fled with her robes flying and her guards swearing. Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141 and imprisoned. But then Matilda lost support and Stephen's allies struck back, recapturing the capital and swapping her for Stephen in a rare royal prisoner exchange. Neither side could deliver the final blow. The war just dragged on. Castles changed hands weekly. Loyalties shifted hourly. Villages were sacked and resacked. At one point, a baron declared loyalty to Matilda, then to Stephen, then to Matilda again, all within 6 months. Each time he was rewarded with land. Stephen, ever the peacemaker, didn't question it. He hated confrontation. By the 1150s, everyone was exhausted. The nobility begged for peace. The clergy wrote open letters pleading for an end to the crownless crown. Even Stephen seemed worn down. His charisma faded, his confidence eroded like chalk in rain. And then came Henry Plantagenet, Matilda's son, and the future Henry II. Young, ambitious, and far more capable than anyone else involved, Henry landed in England with an army in 1153. But instead of fighting, he negotiated. And for once, Stephen made a good decision. In the Treaty of Winchester, Stephen agreed to name Henry as his heir. In return, Henry wouldn't press his claim while Stephen lived. It was a peaceful solution at last after nearly 2 decades of chaos. Stephen died in 1154. He was buried quietly without fanfare. His tomb is modest. His name appears in few songs. No grand statues, no glowing tributes. Just a man who tried, failed, and finally yielded. So why is Stephen here among the worst? Because inaction is its own kind of damage. Stephen didn't massacre innocents. He didn't unleash madness. But he let the kingdom fall into a war that served no one because he refused to lead. He made poor decisions and then doubled down on them. He let loyalty erode. He made promises he couldn't keep. And by the time he realized it, no one trusted him anymore. His reign was one long civil sigh. As you step away from his final castle, its battlements pitted by 1,000 pointless skirmishes, you hear only the wind. The birds have gone quiet. The fields have grown over the scars of war. There is peace now, but it's the kind of peace that arrives too late. Your journey is over. 21 monarchs, 21 disasters, unravelings, miscalculations, betrayals. Each different, each the same, and yet somehow each one deeply, sleepily human. You sit now beneath an old oak. The crowns are gone, the titles whispered, and the night settles over you like a velvet shroud. Let it. So here we are. You've traveled centuries tonight through crumbling castles, silent cathedrals, and the uneasy stillness of too many royal mistakes. You've walked with kings who forgot their duty, who feared their shadows, who fought their brothers, or who simply stared into mirrors wondering if they could shatter like glass. You saw the child emperors, the puppet monarchs, the deluded mystics in the vain. You passed through palaces full of echoes, war camps, full of noise and courts where decisions were made, not with wisdom, but with trembling fingers, or not made at all. But now let it rest. Let the dusty banners fall. Let the wax seals crack, and the ink of decrees fade back into parchment. Let the silver goblets tarnish, and the forgotten bones lie undisturbed beneath chapel floors. It's strange, isn't it? For all their power, for all their crowns and palaces, most of these kings are now remembered, not for what they built, but for what they broke. And yet, even in their failures, they tell us something. Something about ambition, about fear, about what happens when power meets panic, or when duty is left undone. You're safe now. You've stepped away from the throne rooms and the chaos. Your breath slows. The night deepens. The worst is over. Let the silence stretch soft and unbroken. There will be no edicts tomorrow, no court to attend. Just the soft rhythm of sleep and the faint, fading memory of kings who, like everyone, drift into dreams. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.